My second talk will focus more on the methodology of practice theory or praxeology compared to my first talk. In the following, I want to suggest a procedure. I want to suggest the procedure of praxeologizing the objects of inquiry. The ideas that I'm going to present right now are, for the most part, taken from a paper I wrote for a forthcoming book on practice theory edited by Gerd Spargaren and others. And the title of this paper is The Methodological Challenges of Practicing or Practicizing Praxeology. And so I picked some topics out of this paper, and I'm trying to present them now. I'm going to depict the procedure of praxeologizing objects or phenomena to be studied in 2 steps. This is in a first step, praxeologizing social practices of academic writing. I will come up with an empirical example, which means I'm going to introduce an empirical phenomenon, which I then will try to praxeologize. And this empirical phenomenon certainly is quite familiar to all of you. The empirical phenomenon I will try to praxeologize is the social, the academic, the epistemic, the cultural practice of writing in social sciences. This is what we all do and what we all in certain ways know how to do. And this is what I try to look at in a praxeological and analytic perspective. This empirical example hopefully serves best to point out the methodological tasks and, what is more, the empirical challenges of praxeology. I will try to show how praxeologizing the social practice and process of academic writing can provide for highlighting particular and novel aspects and dimensions of this practical, of this epistemic activity. And what is more, praxeologizing academic writing may also lead to questioning prevailing approaches in writing studies and in maybe approaches in and prevailing perspectives on how academic writing should be done and prevailing normative approaches towards academic writing. And subsequently, in a second step, conceptual tools and methods for praxeologizing, I will remark on the actual method and procedure of praxeologizing, and I will discuss some tools of what could become a conceptual toolkit for praxeologizing. This is what David Nicolini pointed out very convincingly in his lecture. The quintessence of this, which I hereby state in advance, so the quintessence of praxeologizing is, in my view, the following. Praxeologizing implies changing perspectives in order to access and to understand the objects of inquiry in the process of their ongoing social production or their destruction, respectively. And this is done mainly to open up new possibilities of describing and understanding. Praxeology adds up to observing and illuminating the observations, the interpretations, the shared understandings and ratifications of participants, and praxeologizing seeks to reconstruct their practical and meaningful constructions of their social reality. This is kind of a hopefully practical definition of what praxeologizing is all about, or can be all about. So I will proceed to my first topic, praxeologizing social practices of academic writing, which means praxeologizing my empirical phenomenon, which actually is academic writing. In the social sciences, writing and theorizing are very closely tied together. Thus, theorizing cannot be understood as purely cognitive or intellectual activity governed by mental models or mental schemes. Rather, to theorize is to activate specific incorporated competences: sketching, drafting, excerpting, yachting, taking notes, and so on. So theorizing involves and becomes manifest in observable and situated collaborations of theorists, texts, artifacts, and technologies like pencil, paper, keyboard, word processing software, communication media, and the like. Thus, producing or writing social theory, for example, is always also a practical accomplishment. Writing in its particular processual and situative dimensions by far exceeds, one can say, by far exceeds merely writing down or putting on paper of theoretical entities already produced and fixed by thinking before. That would be a false description of what writing is all about. We know, not least, as and because we are writing. By writing, we come to conclusions. By writing, we discover ideas. We modify and validate ideas. We put them into perspective. We dismiss them, and we write on. So, contrary to handwriting on paper, word processing software, for example, and other digital artifacts allow specific support for such preliminary and always tentative moves. They help to keep what has just been written in permanent temporariness. What is more, there is an explorative dimension to writing. It is not before the process of writing that we discover what we wish to say or what we wish to state. It's in the very process itself that we discover what we wish to say. This would be one of my praxeological theses or observations, which is the result of praxeologizing writing. Academic or epistemic writing can be seen as a practical mode of thinking, of conceiving, of structuring, of recognizing, of composing, of arranging, mediated by things and artifacts. It at the same time includes mental, cognitive, and intellectual skills, as well as bodily, materially embedded, and technologically mediated processes. Thus, it appears that praxeologizing the production of sociological discourse or the production of social theory provides for a novel empirical understanding of this crucial academic activity. Such an understanding originates from observing and illuminating actual empirical processes of writing. Praxeologizing academic writing practices implies focusing on writing's dynamic and on writing's process-related aspects. They in fact are of epistemic value, but they are not forthrightly tied to the production of outlasting texts, and they cannot be made accessible by textual analysis only. When writing is too closely associated with text production or text formation, all the epistemic modes of writing whose results do not lead to some definition of text are ignored. An example would be excerpts or notes which are never again read, but nevertheless are important in the process of developing certain thoughts and ideas. So empirical studies of academic writing practices therefore should not be constrained to studying text formation. They should focus on the situated, on the practical processuality, where in the very moment of writing, the conditions of writing on are realized. So scribbling, notes, drafts, fragments, versions, revisions, and other traces of writing practices provide important empirical data. Nevertheless, these materials should be complemented by observational and process-related data, which could be generated by, for example, keystroke logging or video recording or other methods and strategies. Although they are coined by individualistic views and beliefs, practices of academic writing are nevertheless socially organized. Writing practices themselves are continuously recruiting participants who enter the practice and who gradually acquire and share foundational principles, foundational criteria regarding the aims, regarding orientations, regarding common understandings, as well as the specific problems and difficulties of certain writing practices. In this respect, for example, accuracy or precision or originality of an argument constitute shared criteria for attributing quality and goodness to practices of writing social theory, for example, in academic discourse. And what is more, those criteria are in close relation to a collectively held ethical norm of being good. Communities of practice constitute collectives whose participants continuously interact and continuously observe each other's productions. Therefore, the social organization of academic writing in social science, for example, at the same time is the result and the precondition for continuous collaboration and continuous cooperation. This encompasses citing, it encompasses reading, reviewing, and criticizing by peers, anticipating shared expectations of theoretical communities, as well as regional gatherings like this conference. In this respect, it is especially interesting to also account for reading. Reading and writing are not distinct activities. And this is because every writer in the process of writing always acts as her own first reader. So the relations of reading and writing include reading of what has just been written by the writer or by the reader herself. And in doing so, she is adopting the perspective of a, you could state, a generalized other, of a related to the community of practice she is participating in. So social practices of academic writing can also be seen as processes of subjectivization. This means participants are obliged to invest and involve themselves in the social practice of academic writing. They are obliged to invest themselves in a really substantial extent. And such investments can be illuminated in terms of Foucauldian analysis of power. For example, the fruitless writing practices, for instance, that mainly junior scientists in the social sciences and humanities are participating in, with persistent engagement, those fruitless writing practices resemble practicing spiritual exercises of forced and continuous work out in subjectivization. Since only a steadily decreasing fraction of submitted manuscripts is published by the leading review journals, while the number of submissions is steadily on the rise, addressing and obtaining readers cannot be considered a realistic goal of such academic writing practices, but they are more or less to be seen as practices in subjectivization. Mass writing of academic texts without chances of being read amounts to a continuous commitment, immune and resistant to constant denial and rejection. Such commitment is continually being tested and has to be manifested time and again in specific monitoring procedures embedded in academic life, meetings, colloquia, conferences, and the like. So everything here, it seems, is about practicing and rehearsing a certain academic style, demonstrating recognition of certain theoretical authorities, following and reproducing certain conventions. Compliance with such rules, compliance with such manners and customs is steadily observed, continuously observed and controlled by only a few reviewers, supervisors, editors, and the like. And in this perspective, academic writing practices itself reveal them to be a rather conformist practice directed not only to publishing, but also to conserving certain theory traditions and to the tedious bodily as well as mental formation of an academic habitus. Oh, this was the wrong direction. So as becomes hopefully clear, praxeologizing academic writing and studying writing as the site of theorizing allows for sketching out process-related practical aspects and dimensions of this epistemic and academic activities. And this allows for counterbalancing prevailing misconceptions of these academic practices also. Praxeologizing academic writing provides the following four, in my view, important, more or less important insights. First, epistemic practices of writing exceed the mere construction and formation of theoretical, sociological, academical text. Second, theoretical knowledge is not to be conceived of as necessarily preceding and instructing acts of writing. In fact, it is being generated within the very epistemic practice of writing themselves. And third, knowing and theorizing do not solely take place in the head of writers, rather they are observable practical procedures which involve mental activities as well as body movement, as well as gestures, as well as material components up to the subjectivization and tedious bodily formation of an academic or an theoretical habitus. So academic writing is not possible without acquiring this also bodily habitus of the academic writer. And fourth, practices of academic writing and theorizing may eventually constitute a normatively integrated and governed form of life. They tend to or extend into a whole form of life. So now, starting from this example of praxeologizing academic writing, which amounts to shedding light on all too well-known phenomenon, maybe shedding new light on this phenomenon, it may generally be argued that praxeology, or that praxeologizing, first of all, is concerned with the misrepresentations of doings and practical activities in the theoretical models, conventions, and sometimes also in the elaborated members' views of the practices, designed to grasp and to explain the practices. The sociology of social practices, in my view, is not for elaborating an empirical and realistic conception of social practices. It rather seeks to develop a methodological and analytical understanding of the practical processuality of social phenomena. And in this methodological perspective, the question whether there really is such a thing as a social practice is just not relevant. More important is the analytical gain provided by seeing an object of or phenomenon of inquiry as an ongoing practical accomplishment of different participants and carriers. And this implies changing perspective in order to understand the object with regard to the process of its perpetual social production, or of its, or seeing it as in the process of its destruction, respectively. So seeing it in the process of its ongoing construction, or, which is the other possibility, seeing it in the process of its ongoing undoing. There's also the undoing of certain things. There is there are contexts where we can observe practices or aspects of, for example, we had this discussion yesterday of undoing age in certain social contexts, or undoing gender in certain contexts. And I would suggest to also focus such aspects. So not always pay attention to the doing, to the production, to the accomplishment and the establishment of certain phenomena, but also ask questions in the direction of how are phenomena undone in certain situations, in certain circumstances. This is also what should be part of praxeological inquiry. So praxeologizing is to open up new possibilities of describing and understanding. analytically focusing an object of inquiry in this way means to construct it. And this is to decontextualize it, this is to transform it, this is to translate it or re-articulate it as an object of praxeological research. So praxeology focuses on the operational and ongoing establishment of social ordering. And according to this methodological decision, normative assumptions or ex-ante definitions of research objects are to be bracketed, they are to be avoided. Unquestioned assumptions, presuppositions, pre-constructions that are often unhesitatingly incorporated in empirical research designs and social theory, they should themselves be turned into empirical objects of inquiry. So praxeological analysis is situating the objects and phenomena in fields of bodily and materially mediated activities and processes. And these are regarded as being organized by shared understandings and by collective practical knowledge. Thus, praxeologizing an object of inquiry amounts to empirical questioning embedded in a constructivist and analytical operation. It means to focus the situated and at the same time the trans-situative accomplishment of the objects under scrutiny. And in the following I'm try to comment on both aspects. So on the aspect of the situative and on the aspect of the trans-situative accomplishment of the objects of inquiry. Constructing the phenomenon in question as an object of praxeological research in a first and important step refers to the constructions of the participants. And this stands for understanding the phenomenon as being members' work, that is, as being naturally organized and accomplished by the participants. Methodologically speaking, in this regard, praxeology pertains to second-order observation, or double hermeneutic, as Anthony Giddens called it. So that means praxeologizing is to observe the observations, the interpretations, the shared understandings and ratifications of participants, and it is to reconstruct their practical and meaningful constructions of their social reality. And the research question, crucial in this regard, reads, how is the phenomenon practically accomplished as this particular and this intelligible phenomenon by the participants? How is it identified reciprocally and interactively made accountable? How is it made accountable? How is it rendered intelligible by the participants and to the participants? There are two additional aspects of methodological relevancy. The first aspect is about figuring out how the implicit normativity of social phenomena and activities should and could be rendered observable. And secondly, the critical competences of members and practitioners have to be emphasized. This latter aspect is important for counterbalancing ethnomethodology's bias towards successful accomplishment of local social order. This ethnomethodological bias can be resolved by accounting for the critical, by always also accounting for the critical, for the destabilizing and for the destructive aspects of members' work. By focusing on members' mobilizing of their shared understanding and their situated practical accomplishment of a phenomenon as a meaningful social act, we assume that the phenomenon or practice is always organized by a particular normativity. We suppose there is a shared practical sense for doing whatever it is in a proper and in an appropriate way. Therefore, there have to be criteria for determining whether this thing or practice is and has been done properly or not. According to such criteria, deviations, breaches, or violations are noticed on the spot. They are sanctioned, they are repaired, they are corrected. This is what especially ethnomethodology and Harold Garfinkel have pointed out very convincingly. Those criteria are at the same time implicit and they are overtly public. which means they can be rendered observable in order to be grasped and reconstructed. Here, the example of academic writing serves very well to clarify this. There are shareable, reportable, accountable, implicit, normative, and public criteria for this activity of writing and for how it should be done. Academic writing therefore constitutes a broadly intelligible social practice, at least within the academic community. Nevertheless, writing usually is rendered unobservable to others and performed in the solitude of the study. As becomes clear now, the public nature of practices, for example, academic writing, and their observability have to be distinguished. They are not to be confounded or equated. And this means there is no observability per se of social practices. Observability is and has to be fabricated. Observability has to be established. Observability has to be achieved by suitable methods of observation, like in the case of academic writing practices, keynote logging, participant observation, video recording, and other methods. So there is no observability per se, but nevertheless, practices like academic writing are overtly public. Also, they are pursued in the solitude of the study, but they are public practices. My next point is concerned with overcoming ethnomethodology's tendency to overemphasize members' successful accomplishment of local social order. In doing so, it is crucial to also shed light on practitioners' critical competences. There's not only coordinated activity helping to establish social ordering, but there are also competent activities of destabilizing, competent activities of practical criticism, which have to be taken into account, also have to be taken into account empirically. Praxeology, therefore, should not only be concerned with members' local accomplishment of social ordering, but also with local questioning, with local ongoing criticism, with local undoing, with local deconstructing. In doing so, praxeology can work to expand the ethnomethodological paradigm. Praxeology can tie in with, for example, the thinking of Luc Boltanski. Boltanski accentuates competent practices of criticizing, reaching from discursive verbal criticism related to regimes of justification to also tacit norms of undermining, of subverting, of obstructing, of rendering, as Boltanski states, of rendering reality unacceptable. And such critical and obstructive activity can also be found within the social practice of academic writing, for example. In this context, for example, frequent plagiarizing could be regarded as a practically undermining and critiquing the cultural concepts of authorship, intellectual property, and individual merit, and therefore questioning, and therefore challenging the normativity incorporated in the social-cultural practice of academic writing. Plagiarizing is only done successful if it is not detected as such. It therefore has to be both distinguished and at the same moment accomplished competently within the practice of academic writing. And this presupposes a specific craftiness and knowing how of the praxis of academic writing and its implicit rules. However, in the long run, plagiarizing will destabilize academic writing practices if it is done by a multitude of participants. And this will probably lead to certain countermeasures like designing and using computer software to detect frauds or issuing ethical guidelines for good academic practice or the like. So eventually, this will result in the transformation of the social practice of academic writing itself. From this, it follows that praxeologizing should also include focusing on how initially working practices eventually corrode, fail, and collapse. Thus, praxeology should adopt a process-oriented perspective and should concentrate on how practices continuously turn into something else, how they self-destruct or are being destructed by their practitioners and participants. So praxeologizing the objects and phenomena of research connotes also to relate the situated local accomplishments of ordering and critique to the trans-situative dimensions of their accomplishment. And this is to study the associations, this is to study the connections, the networks, the linkages of which the local phenomena is a nodal point or just an intersection, and to investigate how these associations emerge, transform, empirically globalize or collapse. This is what also David Nicolini pointed out very convincingly in his talk tomorrow. So situated courses of action are to be conceived as sites in the sense of local processes and manifestations of multi-locally dispersed social practices. And in this regard, in my reading, the philosophical notion of site introduced by Theodor Schetsky can easily be and very productively be connected to analytical procedures of citing and locating prevalent in social and cultural anthropology. Citing amounts to empirically localize complex and global formations that are simultaneously taking place at different sites, and it's an endeavor to render such trans-situative formations observable. So-called multi-sited ethnographies have very convincingly suggested different research strategies of accessing and connecting different sites in order to illuminate how multi-sited objects and phenomena are continuously and multi-locally generated. In detail, George Marcus suggests follow the people. In the case of academic writing, that would mean follow scholars among their different positions, appointments, and sites of migration in investigating, for example, transnational academic discourse and writing practices. Follow the thing. In the case of academic writing, this could mean follow the books, the articles, and their different reprints and translations. Follow the signs, follow the symbols and metaphors, follow the stories, follow the biographies of scholars, follow the conflicts. With respect to academic writing practices, citing, for example, could imply to empirically localize a certain discourse in, for example, social theory by shedding light on its continuous process of production in local discursive, textual, and writing practices and their linkages. In doing so, citing discourse could illustrate the complex networks and associations that are employed in the discursive practice of academic writing. So methodologically, this calls for following the linkages, following the concatenations of texts, of topics, of journals, of institutions, of offices, of departments, of authors, of scholars, of editors, of conferences, and the like. And this also, in my reading, implies to count, to calculate, and map them, to construct surveys of the spatial and temporal extension of a phenomenon or its trajectory, and maybe also to understand its statistical distribution within a population of scholars in order to reveal the whole picture. And at this point, praxeology can also apply a range of quantitative methods and techniques of first-order observation. For example, counting and calculating the numbers of publications, citations, as well as other methods of bibliometrics or scientometrics. And this nevertheless should serve praxeological epistemology, that is to engage in the interpretative project of understanding, picturing, and describing the ongoing practical accomplishment of a phenomenon. And this always amounts also to illuminate how participants interactively and reciprocally render the phenomenon intelligible. As Aaron Sikurel convincingly explains, such an interpretive epistemological project fundamentally differs from the methodology and logic of measurement prevalent in quantitative research. So we can use some of the quantitative methods, but we have to engage them for praxeological epistemology, is what I would like to suggest. For the procedure of praxeologizing social objects and phenomena, it is crucial to always consider the symbolic or discursive meanings they have acquired and to investigate how they are observed and understood by the participants. So participants' accounts and interpretations, as well as broader discursive embedment, are to be treated as meaningful aspects of the empirical phenomena themselves, which always also exist, broadly speaking, in and through practices of interpreting and theorizing. And not only members theorizing, but also sociologists theorizing may substantially contribute to the practical accomplishment and intelligibility of the phenomenon in question. And this is why theoretical, academic, and discursive practices should also reflexively be included in praxeological analysis. Thank you.